Hello, class. Welcome back to digital learning during our pandemic. As you know, we've made a lot of changes, and from here on out, our class is going to have a pretty strict structure of review. So, just to reiterate real quick, so you guys hear this as well as you saw the visuals on Google Classroom. But every week from now on, we are going to start our week with taking that practice exam if you did not do so the weekend or Friday before that Monday. Wednesday, we're going to have a video review, which you guys definitely opted for the video over the Zoom lesson. So here we are. And then Friday, we are going to have a study guide, and I'm going to go ahead and open that practice exam for the next little chunk that we're going to be studying or reviewing over. So you guys know this lesson is on periods 1 through 3, and then next lesson will be 4 to 5, and then 6 to 7. And that last week, we're just going to take a full practice exam. So we have a lot of practice exams ahead of us, which is good because the more you guys practice, the more you get to actually do this. The more you have to think about these things and writing a DBQ, the better prepared you're probably going to be. And the more feedback I can give you guys to help kind of guide you along on that journey. I really thought, since we were going to only have a 45-minute exam, that would mean that you guys would probably be doing an LAQ or a set of SAQs. I was wrong. And we are going to be doing a DBQ, which you guys know we've only done one full DBQ all semester long, but we've definitely analyzed various primary sources, talked about sourcing multiple times. So I think that with this extra practice exams that we're going to do every week, I think you guys are going to be ready. Just to remember, which I will post that rubric if I haven't already done so onto Classroom so you guys can see the difference in your DBQ which you will have now because it's a shorter, smaller version of the DBQ. The difference here, in addition, is you have complete usage of your notes, complete usage of your study guide, even web searches during the exam. The catch is, though, you only have 45 minutes, so I want to make sure you guys make sure you are as prepared as can be. So if you need to look something up, it's only very quickly, swiftly, so that you can get back to writing, basically. So this video, we are going to do a big history review on periods 1 through 3. So let's get started. Okay, so looking at period 1, which the years for this period is 1491 to 1607. The reason these years were chosen because 1491 is going to be the first year of European contact with the Americas, and then 1607 because that is the year in which we have Jamestown being established, which is the first permanent settlement, first permanent English settlement. So most of this period, which is a very short period, a very small one, is going to be about the ways in which Native Americans lived before the Europeans, in addition to what did that initial contact with both sides really look like, and then the Columbian exchange, exchanging things from the Americas to the Europe, Africa, and vice versa. So you guys see here maize is underlined. That is a term from our AP curriculum or College Board curriculum. Anytime you guys see a underlined word, just a term, I want you guys to add it to your study guide if you don't already have it. Most likely you have a lot of these things, but if not, just go ahead and add it. That way you have that to use if you need it. So the thing that you really need to understand about Native Americans, especially before the Europeans arrived, is there was no set, this is how Native Americans live. There is no set, this is necessarily always the religion, this is always the lifestyle, because Native Americans are very diverse. And depending upon what Native American we're talking about and what region of the United States we're talking about, life for that Native American was very different. Basically, Native Americans had different lives according to the resources they had available around them. And as you guys know, the United States has a very diverse geography. And so this is why their life was very different. So, for example, if we look at Native Americans in eastern United States, we're looking at hunter-gatherers, and we're looking at people who are living in a semi-permanent or a permanent dwelling, depending on what Native American tribe we are studying. And then if we look at central United States in the Great Plains, Great Basin area, you are going to see very little farms, and as such, very few permanent dwellings, and most time people were nomadic, meaning they were living from place to place based off of hunting and basically trying to find buffalo and resources to survive. And then within the western United States, we're going to have a lot of people who live off of fishing. And with the timber locally, a lot of their houses are made out of that, and it's very permanent dwellings. So it really depends on where the Native Americans live whenever we talk about their different lifestyles. So whenever we actually look into the Europeans and the European reasons for coming over to the Americas, it's really going to be different depending on what nation we are talking about. For the Spanish, we're going to see the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. A lot of, whenever we actually study this and we look at this, a lot of it boils down to competition. It boils down to resources, to accumulating more resources than other European nations to try to enrich your nation. And this is really why we see the Spanish first come over to the Americas. It's because of the vast resources and the opportunities, the abundant and unknown opportunities that this land provided. We're going to have the encomienda system within Spanish America. Now, the Spanish also set up a strict caste system. They are very controlling of their colonies, and as such, they normally force natives to assimilate into their colony and give them jobs or enslave them, which is what that encomienda system was. Now, this initial enslavement of Native Americans is eventually going to be replaced by African labor, especially as a lot of those Native Americans end up dying from diseases that they first received from contact with the Europeans. But that very first slavery that we see in the Americas is going to be Native Americans through that encomienda. So whenever we look at Native Americans and we look at Africans during this period, one thing to really understand is this idea of autonomy, in which we see this as a constant theme in the next couple of 100 years. This idea that you have these Europeans with superior technology and resources and wealth, while at the same time you have Native Americans and you have African peoples who are attempting to self-rule, and they are attempting to gain independence when they can, to try to preserve what type of autonomy they can. All right, guys, the Columbian Exchange. So whenever I refer to the Columbian Exchange, I'm referring to everything that was going to be exchanged at this time as the quote-unquote Old World and the New World met. So whenever I say the Old World, I'm generally looking at it from the perspective of the European that viewed Europe and Africa and Asia as already these known locations in the world. And whenever we look at the New World, that's going to be the quote-unquote Americas, the North and South America, which are unknown at this time to the rest of the world. And because these two areas have been able to develop for thousands of years with very minimal contact, what we're going to see is a very different ecosystems, and there is a lot of different animals, a lot of different foodstuffs, and a lot of different diseases these two different geographical locations have basically developed, that whenever they come into contact with, they're going to trade for better or worse back and forth. Another effect of that Columbian exchange is going to be the development of the slave trade in that Middle Passage, in which we're going to talk about a little bit more here in just a moment. One thing to also know about all this is we have the Columbian exchange, and as this is an APUSH class, we generally focus on the Americas, and we generally focus on the effects of all these things within the United States, such as the Columbian exchange is going to lead to Native Americans, a lot of Native Americans dying from different diseases brought over, such as smallpox. Some estimates of up to 90% of all Native Americans are going to die just from disease alone. So a lot of what we look at is from what's going to be the effect upon the Americas. But one of the effects upon Europeans at this time with the Columbian exchange is going to be more foodstuffs available. We're going to see an increase in population in these areas, especially whenever we have potatoes and we have maize that is a starch and can sustain large groups of populations. And then we're also going to see an increase in capitalism. Basically, a lot of times due to joint stock companies, are due to European companies who decide to invest on a voyage to settle in the Americas with the idea that, hey, I put up a little bit of money right now, you use my money and use my resources to make yourself a settlement, and then what you farm or what you collect from that area in gold or resources, you're going to bring back, and I'm going to get not only what I gave you to initially take that voyage, but I'm going to get more back. So this idea of investing and getting more money back is going to basically bring Europe out of the feudal era into capitalist economies. All right, so period 2. Whenever we look at period 2, we're looking at the dates 1607 to 1754. Now, 1607 we talked about Jamestown, and then 1754 is the beginning of the 7 Years' War. So whenever we look at this time period, we're going to be talking a lot about European colonization, how different European nations are going to colonize the America, and then looking at British colonies and seeing the various differences within these colonies. And so we begin to really shift our focus to how did these areas develop to a point in which they're ready to start wanting to declare independence from Britain, basically. So a big portion of this unit is understanding the difference in French, Spanish, English styles of colonizations, the difference in some of their goals, and also a big portion of this is the differences in the way in which they treated the Native Americans. So if we look at the French and the Dutch, a lot of times their goal was to establish the fur trade industry. Usually they were the most friendly with Native Americans, often intermingling in a non-forceful way and actually promoting things like intermarriages to build diplomatic relationships. So then we have the Spanish, which is the extreme end of that. The goal in the Spanish was to enrich Spain with natural resources. They're going to look at their colonies with a very strict control and establish very tight control over the native populations. Whenever we look at the Spanish, we also have to think about the Inquisition and the influence of the Catholic Church within these colonies. So a lot of that tight control of the natives, they're going to be, the Spanish is going to try to justify with saying, well, we have this tight control to try to save the Native Americans. So then we have the English. Now, the English is going to be a bit different within all this. Number one, the English is kind of late in the game to begin with. And then the English are also coming over for different reasons than the French or the Spanish. A lot of the English actually come over so that they can settle and create better opportunities for themselves and for their future descendants. So it wasn't an idea of, let me go somewhere and get rich and come back to Europe. such as most settlers with the French, Dutch, and the Spanish, but it was this idea of let me go to this area and settle it for a better life for myself. A lot of this had to do with economic opportunity, but depending upon which colony we talk about, we also have colonies in which their goal was more religious freedom or the freedom to practice the type of Christianity that they wanted without opposition from that Anglican church. And then we have social mobility, the idea that I can actually have myself a plot of land and I can give that to my descendants, because in the Americas there is land available, which in Europe there's not going to be a whole lot of land available to commoners, but there was in the Americas. Now, the English have a very different relationship with the natives than the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. Now, the English did trade with the natives, but outside of trade, most of the colonies are not going to want to interact with the natives. And this is very different from the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish, in which the English really promoted a separation of these two cultures. The idea was we have our land, and if Native Americans are on it, we want to push them off. But once they're pushed off, we want them to basically keep to themselves. All right, so whenever we look at the colonies, we need to actually kind of separate them into four main regions. We have the New England colonies, the Middle, the Chesapeake colonies, and the Southern colonies, in which these colonies are very different, and understanding their geographical differences is a big portion of this class. So with the New England colonies, remember the Puritans, remember they were very homogeneous, which means they're very like-minded, very similar. A lot of times they had small farms. They're also known for shipbuilding and commerce as their economic activity. Now, whenever we look at the middle colonies, we are looking at a very diverse colony in comparison to the other colonies. Not just demographically or ethnically, but religiously as well. In fact, the middle colonies not only are very diverse, but are known as the most religiously tolerant as well. The main economic opportunities of the middle colonies is going to be these cereal crops, such as wheat, for an example. So if we look at the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland and Virginia, the main economic opportunity here is going to be tobacco, some of that cash crops. Now, the economy is very reliant upon indentured servitude in the early years of the colonies, but generally that is going to shift to African slaves. And then we have these southern colonies, so a bit more of the cash crops this time, sugar, some rice, once again, heavy use of slaves. Also, the southern colonies are going to be developing after Virginia and the Chesapeake colonies. So by the time the southern colonies are developed, the Americas is seeing much more populations of African slaves. So as these colonies are developing, they are initially using African slaves, which is different from the Chesapeake colonies. The only other thing that I meant to mention to you guys is for the Chesapeake and the southern colonies. You can also think of these as the plantation economies. It's another way to think of that cash crop and the economic activity. All right, guys. So your DBQ was about the indentured servitude, shift to African slavery, and really looking at slavery as a historical development within the colonies. And the reason I chose this DBQ is because if we look at the actual history of DBQs within that the College Board has been putting forth, it's been a long time since we've seen a DBQ actually looking at slavery and looking at this as a historical development, which doesn't mean that you guys are necessarily going to have a DBQ over this. but I want us to have DBQs that are a little bit, that we haven't seen in a little while as far as the topics. That way you have a greater chance, anyways, of actually having this as a type of DBQ. So whenever we actually look at the development of slavery within the United States and slavery as an institution, I want you guys to really understand that in the beginning, with indentured servitude, with the indentured servants coming to the United States, we are going to see slaves initially come into the United States as well. But slaves, whenever they initially come into the United States, is going to be very different from how slavery is going to develop. And so whenever we actually first see slaves come over to the United States, there is no laws actually recording what it means to have a slave. And as such, you have some slaves, for example, who were actually free after being baptized, or some slaves who, after a period of working, their owners said, well, you've worked this long and you've put out this much work, so I believe now you have your freedom. Now, whenever I mention these instances, I'm talking about early 1600s, whenever the institution of slavery has not developed yet within the United States. Because I want you guys to understand that this did develop for a number of different reasons. The first one was one that many of you guys mentioned during your DBQ, and I'm glad, is the lack of indentured servants. So you guys know that a lot of the base for that initial economy is going to be indentured servitude. But what is going to happen is that over time, indentured servitude is actually going to decline. And this happens for a number of reasons. Number one, there's more land that is becoming available in Europe. There's better living conditions in Europe. We talked about that within Columbian Exchange. And there is also going to be a decline in people in the colonies seeking indentured servitude because of Bacon's Rebellion, which some of you guys mentioned in your DBQs, and I like that. That's a nice historical evidence to draw in for this DBQ. In addition, while you have this decline in indentured servitudes, you also have an increase in demand for the cash crops within the Chesapeake and the southern colonies, that tobacco and sugar. And as such, there was a new labor source that colonists are going to seek. And they're really going to seek that in African slaves. Now, once African slaves begin to increase, then there needed to be a justification. And so that justification that the Europeans are going to come up with is going to be racism, it's going to be slave codes, and a strict racial system that basically says this is what it means to be a slave. This is what it means for your children. In addition, outlawing intermarriages or interrelations, for an example. We're going to see these strict laws basically come into place to legalize slavery. Now, just like I mentioned earlier, whenever we talk about Native Americans and we talk about African Americans, one thing you've got to understand is that throughout American history, you always have instances in which you have people trying to exert and trying to maintain whatever kind of autonomy or self-rule, independence they can. For African Americans at this time, it's going to be language, culture, such as the Gula language that does develop as a way to maintain that African heritage. It combines different African languages. And then we have outright rebellion, such as the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, in which you have African Americans literally... Luca, calm down. Sorry, my dog is getting riled up. Okay, in which you actually have African Americans fighting back, which is going to actually contradict what a lot of these slave owners are saying at this time. By making statements such as, well, slaves are happy in these circumstances, this is better, basically arguments that are creating and perpetuating racism within southern United States, or I'm sorry, southern colonies at this time. But Stono Rebellion is an exact example of African Americans attempting to try to gain whatever type of autonomy they can and fight back against this slavery, this institution that is developing at this time. Okay. So whenever we look at Native Americans at this time, I want you guys to understand that Native Americans are often going to group up with different Europeans to try to fight against other Native Americans, to try to attempt to gain whatever resources they were after or whatever land they were after. And so you're actually going to see some of the Native groups try to play the Europeans for their own advantage. And this is something we also see in period 3. Except against other Native, it's going to be against other European powers. So this is an attempt of the Native Americans to try to exert and maintain that autonomy as well. So some exact examples we have of Native Americans fighting back is going to be the King Philip's War, and this is actually mentioned within your curriculum. We have a Native American rebellion in New England, as Native Americans are going to fight back against the colonists. Basically, they become fed up with the system of forming treaties, breaking those treaties, taking the land, forming new treaties. They're basically going to get fed up and try to fight back in whatever way they can. Now, this rebellion actually lasts about 18 months, so it is carried on for some time. But in the end, the colonists do push them back. Then we have the Pueblo Revolt, which is going to be Native Americans revolting against the Spanish Empire at this time, and especially fight back against the Spanish forced assimilation, trying to force their cultures, and particularly their religion upon the Native Americans. And this rebellion actually ends in some success for about 10 years, in which the Spanish are completely expelled from this area. Eventually, the Spanish do regain control. However, this time we do have a lax in some of those forced assimilation policies and strict control. So whenever we study this period, another thing to note is the changes in culture that is happening within the colonies. So the Anglicization, for example, of the British colonies, whenever we look at Anglican, we're talking about British, and ization becoming, so becoming or taking up British culture basically within the colonies. Now we are going to see this and a lot of this happening because of print culture at this time coming into the colonies from Britain, basically influencing people who read it and influencing different types of clothing or different types of things that people bought based off of magazines, for example, that they're reading. In addition, we are also going to see the spread of enlightenment as well due to that print culture coming out of Europe into the Americas and into those British colonies. Now, if you guys will remember, the idea of enlightenment is to focus on not only reason and intelligence, but the whole idea of I am enlightened. I have now awoken to the world, and instead of looking at the world through this little type view, I now understand. I view things from logic. I don't just accept that the world is flat. I need reasons for the world being flat. And since I don't have reasons for the world being flat, and I have more reasons for it being round, therefore I will believe it is round. Not because of superstition or religion, but because there is scientific processes and reasons that went into discovering that the world is indeed round. Which, by the way, at this time, it was a definite known fact that the world was round. So that was just an example. Okay, Now, some of these thinkers that we have Montesquieu, we have Locke. Another Enlightenment thinker is going to be Rousseau. The main Enlightenment thinker, whenever we look at the Americas, the person who's known for being the Enlightenment thinker of the Americas is actually Benjamin Franklin. He's going to spread a lot of these Enlightenment ideas in our colonies. All right, and then we also have mercantilism, which you guys need to know from this period. The whole idea of mercantilism is this idea that as a colony, you exist to enrich that mother country. So as a British colony, you exist to enrich Britain, and everything you do in the trade in which you are partaking in should be for the mother colony's benefit, which is why we have this picture up here. Because the idea is the colonies should actually take their raw goods directly to the mother country. The mother country will develop those raw goods into finished products and sell to other colonies. So you should not try to sell with other colonies because that would only enrich your colony. But upon trade, you should be focusing on enriching the mother country. So instead of trading to other colonies, you should trade with England. Now, there's two major problems with this. Number one, we have distance. You had the Atlantic Ocean, which made enforcing these mercantilist policies very difficult, very time-consuming, and Britain had to use a lot of resources if they were really going to enforce these policies. And then in addition, you had salutary neglect. So salutary neglect is this idea that as long as the colonies are benefiting Britain, as long as they are not directly opposing Britain, and Britain is still having at least some resources and some economic prosperity from the colonies, that the mother colony, or mother country, or Britain is not going to actually directly control or strictly control mercantilism and enforce mercantilism upon the people. So because of Britain's neglect and forcing the colonies to actually trade directly with Britain to enrich their country, because they neglected to enforce these policies, we're going to see colonies that are very self-governing. We're going to see colonies that are making decisions without having to get necessarily approval from that mother country. And colonies that are beginning to enrich themselves, that are very democratic for the era. One thing to know too, that the democracy within this area, very interestingly enough, is going to be based on English models that we see at this time because of the influence of English culture upon the colonies. All right, so now we are shifting into period 3. We have 1754, which is that beginning of the 7 Years' War. The cutoff date for this period is going to be 1800 with Jefferson's election. Now, this period focuses mostly on that war for independence, basically the build-up and tensions for that revolution, the war, the aftermaths, and the building of the young United States. So whenever we look at this period, a lot of it has to do with government and politics. Which is also why it interests me so, because I like politics and government. Okay, so 7 Years' War. So basically the 7 Years' War is a war over territory, and it's a war in which it was more of a matter of when it was going to happen, not really if it was going to happen, because you had British colonists that kept pushing further and further west as you had French territory and fur trade set up with the natives, and they as well were pushing south and pushing east. So it was only a matter of time before these two countries, France and Britain, and their claims to American territory are going to come into direct conflict with one another. Now, after this war, we do see Britain win this war. It is a very costly war. French is removed from North America, but Britain has a lot of war debt. Britain has a lot of debt they have to pay off for the war, and since they believe, or since the viewpoint is, well, the 7 Years' War benefited the colonies the most, that the colonies should really start paying Britain back to try to pay back or try to pay off some of this war debt. Basically, the 7 Years' War, while not being the only or not being just the causation for the American Revolution, is going to be really the catalyst for everything that's going to happen. And whenever we look at the string of events that is going to happen, which, by the way, there's so many different stuff here. We're not going to talk about all this. We're just kind of like group it all into one phenomenon, which I'm sure you guys in your study guide actually found more detailed information because there's just so much stuff that's happening. But that 7 Years' War is basically the catalyst for it all. So we have, for an example, that 7 Years' War, which you guys know is going to end in Britain taxing the colonies to try to pay back the war debt. We're going to see the Stamp Act, in which we actually have paper that is being taxed in the colonies. And as such, we have the Stamp Act Congress, which is the colonies getting together to actually protest to Parliament in Britain to basically say, hey, why are you taxing us without actually having someone in your parliament to represent us? Now remember, a parliament is similar to a Congress, in which the job of the parliament, or the very simple job of the parliament, is to create laws. And within the parliament and within a Congress, the idea is that each member who is voting represents a group of people. So it's supposed to be democratic in nature. And so for the parliament to make decisions without having someone to actually vote for their side, someone being the colonist side, to vote for them, they're basically making decisions without consulting them, without having anybody to represent them, their wants, their needs, and their perspective in all of this. So because of this Stamp Act Congress, we basically see Britain come forth and decide to repeal that Stamp Act, so kind of give the colonists a little bit of what they wanted, while at the same time coming forth with the Declaratory Act, in which we're going to see Britain and the Parliament basically state, well, the Americas do not have the right for representation because the American colonies exist to enrich the mother country. And as such, the Parliament can decide to tax the Americas however they wish. And the colonists should just deal with it, which, as you guys know, is not going to be well received in the colonies. Another example of this is going to be the Townshend Acts, in which we see taxation on a number of different goods: paint, paper, glass, lead, tea. We're going to have the colonists, because there is no taxation without representation, because they feel they're being unjustifiably taxed. We're going to see the Boston Tea Party, in which we have a group of colonists protest by actually dumping tea into the harbor, laying waste to that tea that is supposed to be taxed to pay off some of that war debt. As such, the Parliament in Britain is going to respond with the Intolerable Acts, which is a strand of different acts meant to basically squash the resistance from the colonists. One very famous part of the Intolerable Acts is going to be the Quartering Acts, in which the colonists basically have to actually allow British soldiers, redcoats, to come and stay in their homes, and they do not have the right to say no. So you have this taxation, you have this protest, then you have the British trying to squash that protest forcefully without trying to give that political representation or that political compromise that the colonists are wanting. And as such, you're going to see that First Continental Congress in which the colonists get together to talk about these things and the next steps towards achieving what they want to achieve. You basically have a number of factors at play here. You are going to have people who have been self-ruling themselves. These different colonies have on various stages, making their own decisions for their colony. You're going to have enlightenment, meaning you're going to have people thinking about these things with reason, with logic, this idea that the individual should be making these decisions and that the individual can make these decisions. That just because you are born into power, say a king, does not give you the right to make decisions that infringe upon my rights. As an individual, I should have certain rights bestowed upon me. So all these things are packed within the Enlightenment, and all these things are coming into play with why the colonists end up declaring independence. You guys, if you remember, we actually read a portion of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which at this time, Common Sense was very wildly read, not just amongst the elite or the upper class within these colonies, but the middle class as well. And it's going to help spur and develop even more resistance or colonial resistance to what's seen as British authoritarian rule. What's really interesting at this time is that whenever we look at these things, we look at people pushing forth and wanting independence. That actual shift from arguing with Britain to outright declaring independence because we can no longer deal with these people. We are going to see this not just within the upper class within the colonies, the middle class, and a number of different professions, even some like blacksmiths, for example, or just merchants, artisans, women who are getting on board with supporting this revolution in any way they can. We're going to have that Declaration of Independence written by Jefferson, Adams, Benjamin Franklin, in which we see basically accumulation of all this Enlightenment ideology with Britain not wanting to give the colonies their freedoms or their political representation. And within this Declaration of Independence, we're going to have a list of grievances, of everything that Great Britain has done wrong. One of the big things you got to understand about the Declaration of Independence was that this document is really meant to justify why the colonists are doing this. Not just with England, because as far as the colonists most likely at this time do not think that the British Parliament and King is going to read this and say, okay, have your independence. Really, why they're writing this document is so that other nations, in particular European nations, will read this and side with them in this war. So it is actually a political move here. So we have the colonial war for independence. We are going to see the United States win, which at the time there was a lot of challenges, a lot of problems within the United States. Particularly, Britain was a very powerful country, and the United States at this time, which was colonies, a collection of colonies, did not have that military or that financial backing that Great Britain is going to have. A lot of the reasons in which the colonists did succeed, though, the biggest reason that we usually cite is going to be France's role in all this and actually coming to the aid of the colonists and the patriots to fight back against the British on the side of the colonists. And also ideology. The colonists cared about this war much more than the average Briton did. The colonists believed they're fighting for their rights. And as such, that is going to be very strong ideology. And if it is a war of ideology, in this case, the colonists definitely win against the Brits. Okay, so after that war for independence and after the success of the colonists and the patriots and their cause, we are going to see the first government of the United States in the Articles of Confederation. Now, the number one success of the Articles in which we can see is definitely got to be that Northwest Land Ordinance. Basically, the ordinance sets up a system for territories to actually become states, especially pertaining right here to the Northwest Territory. And it is going to be successful as we have settlers crossing the Appalachian Mountains and settling into new territories. This is going to be a system that allows them to establish statehood. We do see slavery outlawed in this territory. We see public education and the protection of private property. The idea that these settlers can settle in this area and own their own property. Which you guys know, part of the War for Independence and part of liberty is defined right now as being able to control or really own the land upon which you have, that the state cannot come and take that away from you. And at this time, that's how you define liberty. That's how you define rights. The idea for what it means to have liberty really changes in the next couple hundred years in the United States. But at this time, liberty was defined by property, the right to own. All right, guys, so we're going to have the Constitutional Convention, which the Constitutional Convention is going to be the convention in which we see delegates from the colonies get together and basically say, well, the Articles of Confederation are not working out. We need to establish a government that fits the needs of the people a bit better, which I forgot to really mention, but up here, some of those weaknesses of the Articles is going to be a weak central government that could not tax, no military. In addition, you needed 6 out of 13 states to actually pass laws. And seeing as our Congress today can barely pass laws, which is a simple majority, you can bet that 9 out of 13 was very difficult. All 13 required to amend articles, which is definitely very hard to achieve in the United States at any moment in American history. And Shays' Rebellion, which we studied in depth a little bit further with Shays' Rebellion. But you guys know, if you're looking for a precise piece of historical evidence to prove that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, you can look at this rebellion. All right, so we're going to have the Constitutional Convention, in which we have delegates meet to actually talk about, okay, so the Articles were a complete failure. Now let's create a new government, a government that can better meet the needs of the people. So we have a series of compromises to create this new government, this constitution that will eventually be ratified by all 13 states. So all 13 eventually agree to this constitution. We are going to have federalism, the idea that you have individual state governments that are controlling most of the laws and deciding most of the laws within their states. And you have one federal government as well that operates in its own entity for certain things such as protecting the whole country, from certain things such as interstate commerce or trade between different states. But a lot of the power, though, is going to be maintained within the state. So the idea that you have two separate governments that do two separate things is the idea of federalism. And separation of powers. the idea that we have three main powers within the federal government. We have that judicial branch, we have that executive, and that legislative, and they each have separate powers, and they each have a power to check the other to make sure that each branch of government is doing what it should be doing and no one is abusing their power. So just to review, in case you guys need this, maybe you forgot from your civics class, you definitely need to know this for your exam. Within the three branches, we have that judicial branch, which will evaluate laws. We have that legislative branch, which will create laws. And then we have that executive branch, which will execute laws. Executive is president, legislative is Congress, and judicial is the federal court system. All right, so a couple of things to know for your exam, a couple of compromises that we're going to see. We're going to have the Great Compromise. We're also going to have the 3/5 compromise. The Great Compromise is the compromise for representation in Congress that we have today. You guys know we have two parts of Congress, or two parts of those people who make laws. We have the Senate, and then we have the House of Representatives. Now, if we look at the Senate, we have two members of the Senate from each state. So doesn't matter about the population, doesn't matter about the size. Each state has two votes to represent itself when making federal laws. That's the Senate. Now then you have the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is each different state has a different population. And since it has different populations, they should carry different weights within their votes. So meaning if a state has more population, then, well, it should have more power to decide federal laws. So that's what makes the basis of that House of Representatives. And since Arkansas does not have a very large population compared to many other states, that is why we have two members of the Senate, just like everybody else, and then we have four members of the House of Representatives, where other states that have much more populations have much more representatives. So that means that Arkansas gets 4 votes in the House because we have less population. So the Great Compromise is really going to be a compromise that is going to please states that are arguing, well, I have a lot more population, so I should have a lot more power within the federal government. But that's also going to please those states that don't have as much population, but feel that they too should have significant power in, or at least some sort of equal power within their federal government. And then we're going to have the 3/5 compromise. Now, this compromise is going to be compromise in which we see southern colonies, southern states actually pushing forth to say, wait a minute, we have a significant slave population, even though they're not counted as citizens within the House of Representatives to make up that citizenship count, which is the census, by the way, if you didn't know, that is going to decide our voting power. We should actually have representation because we do have slaves as well, even though they're not citizens. So then you had states that had already outlawed slavery, or states that never really had very many slaves. That's going to be just kind of like, wait a minute, why should this population count whenever they're technically not citizens? You could abolish slavery, which, by the way, at the Constitutional Convention, you do have people pushing for the abolition of slavery. So in the end, between states that have no slaves and states that have large populations of slaves, we're going to see the 3/5 compromise. Basically, the idea that a slave is actually going to count as 3/5 of a vote, and 60% of all of your slave population can be counted towards representation. And we're also going to see the slave trade compromise. because we had people pushing forth for the abolition of slavery, we're going to see not an outright abolition of slavery, but we are going to see a date set in the Constitution for the end of the international slave trade, in which that date is going to be 1808. Basically, because you had these people within the Constitutional Convention that were pushing forth to end slavery, and you had some states that were very outright defiant against abolitionists and defiant in their belief that they should have the right to have this institution within their state. The Constitution kind of tries to really dot around the problem of slavery to try to not really settle it. And because we don't really see this settlement, this is going to be one reason why the Civil War or this conflict becoming an even bigger conflict was just bound to happen. And then we have the Bill of Rights within our Constitution. So this is going to be added after the Constitutional Convention, but the Bill of Rights are going to deal with individual rights. And because this Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, we do have the anti-feds at this time that are happy, or at least compromised enough, to support the ratification of the Constitution. Because remember, every single state is actually ratifying this Constitution. That would be like the United States today getting together in every single one of the 50 states within the United States actually agreeing on something. So it's very tremendous, very significant. All right, so Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the American Revolution. Because of what happened within the United States, we are going to see a big impact on areas outside of the United States. We're going to have the French Revolution basically take a lot of what Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin is going to be saying about Enlightenment at this time and apply it to their revolution as well against the monarchy in France. We're going to see rebellions in Haiti and multiple rebellions, a string of them, in Latin America as well. So basically, the United States is the initial Declaration of Independence and War for Independence that kind of is a catalyst for other revolutions as well. I do want you guys to understand Native Americans and Native Americans' relationship with the United States is going to be a big theme in this course, if you didn't already understand that, through periods 1 through 3, all up until, for your exam anyways, period 7, the idea that most of this theme is going to revolve around the Native Americans attempting to maintain that autonomy. And within this time period, it is going to be the Native Americans working with different Europeans and allying themselves with different tribes in an effort to gain whatever territory, to preserve whatever territory they have and keep the settlers off their territory. And we're going to see treaties being made with the United States that are already only really honored whenever it best fits the United States. And then once the treaty gets in the way of settlers wanting that land, we're going to have the United States break that treaty. And so then Native Americans are forced into a different territory, another treaty is made, and everything is good until settlers want that territory as well. So the young United States and the relationship with Native tribes at this time is going to be one in which not a lot of Native American sovereignty is really respected. All right, guys, so George Washington's farewell address is going to warn against becoming entangled in foreign alliances, which is very interesting, seeing as for the next couple hundred years we are going to be entangled in the affairs of other countries throughout most of American history and up to current day. And then political parties, which is also very interesting because the first American political parties is actually going to be formed in his own cabinet under his own leadership. So even though George Washington warns against this, we see this being developed while he is president. So a couple of other pieces of history that we definitely want to make sure we talk about at least a little bit. Republican motherhood. So the effects that all these changes have on gender studies at this time. We are going to see the role of women shift into being teachers and to help raise the children, not just be good citizens, but good citizens who have values of the republic and values of democracy and their place in this republic society, which is going to enable women to gain more access to education, because if they're going to be good teachers and raise the best American citizens, then they need access themselves first to education. So it helps to slightly expand women's role in society in this way. In addition, you guys know during the Constitutional Convention, this idea of abolition and support towards abolition is going to expand at this time. You know, these questions of liberty, you have this enlightenment, you have these people pushing forth with rights, this idea that every individual should have certain rights and the government should not take those rights away from them. And that's going to resonate well within and for the abolition movement, and is going to actually gain more supporters towards this movement, which you guys know this movement is going to just increase from here on out. While we have this movement that is increasing due to these questions of liberty and questions of, is the United States really living up to what it's supposed to stand for? We see the expansion of slavery. We see the expansion of slavery west. We see the expansion of slavery more into the deep south. And we see slavery slightly changing as well into something in which we see cotton production being really the economic basis, and cotton production in the South being reliant upon the institution of slavery. All right, so I wanted to talk real quick about these political parties. So this is not very... Okay. All right. So the two major political parties that are going to form during President Washington's administration, we are going to see the Federalist versus the Democratic Republicans. Now, the leader of the Federalist Party is going to be Alexander Hamilton. The leaders of the Democratic Republicans, we've got Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Now, in addition, on the Federalist side, we do often have Washington supporting Hamilton as well. Whenever we look at these two different parties, some of the biggest things to really understand is not just, of course, who they appeal to, like this chart says, which the Federalists appeal to more of the upper class, and the Democratic Republicans are really going to be supported by farmers and more of the quote-unquote lower socioeconomic class within the United States at this time. But the biggest thing is really going to be about what is the role of the government in our life, and how much control should the federal government really have. The Federalists believe in a stronger federal government. They believe that in the idea of implied powers, that the federal government should be able to do something even if it is not explicitly stated within the Constitution, whereas the Democratic Republicans have this idea that states should have more power than the federal government, and if something is not directly outlined as a power of the federal government, well, then the federal government shouldn't be doing this. So the idea is the Federalist like bigger, more powerful federal government, where the Democratic Republicans want a smaller federal government and more state rights. So some of the things from our curriculum, you have the Federalists supporting an increase in tariffs. You have the Federalists supporting that national bank, which is a big issue at this time. where the Democratic Republicans do not support this. In addition, when we talk about the formation of these political parties, it's also really important to understand what's happening in the world and how that's impacting politics in the United States. Whenever we look at the French Revolution, which you guys know is going to start right after the American Revolution or soon after, we're going to have the Federalists support the British and support more of the monarchy within France, where the Democratic Republicans is going to support the French Revolution. Also, the Democratic Republicans wanted the United States to take a role in actually becoming involved in the French Revolution. The idea was, well, the French came to our defense when we were fighting against the British, so why is the United States not fighting on side of the French as they are trying to fight against their monarchy and declare their independence? So a lot of these differences and should we become entangled in foreign affairs is going to create two different groups who oppose each other at this time and have different ideas for not only what should the government within the United States look like, how powerful should the federal government be, but also what should the government's role be in foreign affairs? What should the role of the United States be in foreign affairs? So all these different questions for the young United States is causing these two political parties to form. All right, guys, so I believe that is about everything. I think this was quite a long presentation, but we did cover a lot of history, and I didn't go in depth at all. My idea is that you guys already went in depth within the study guides, so I want these videos to just kind of be not only reiterating this material, but kind of combining all of these things together and making some of those more big connections across themes, or like the big history is what the idea is. So if you guys have any questions, any concerns, you can feel free to email, feel free to message me at any time. I put the remind up on Google Classroom, so if you didn't already have that, you can get that to message me, which that message my phone directly, so it's like texting me. So I get that pretty fast, and I can reply back to that if you have any questions or concerns. In addition, I do want us to have a Zoom meeting just to touch base with you guys. So do try to make an effort to attend that, just so that we can make sure that you guys know what's going on and make sure that you guys are up to date with everything. All right, guys. Make sure that you are safe. Make sure that you are doing your due diligence with your studies.